Hi there, Dr. Brian here. In response to my posting recently on YouTube about the Chicago-Boston experiments during the Spanish flu epidemic, I found it. And so I've got a copy of it here. Now, I can't share that for copyright reasons, but what I can do, I can give you the link and you could buy it yourself. But I thought I'd go over it and read it so we can see here, it's here that I'm going to be reading. So very interesting. So it was run in conjunction with the Navy at a quarantine island in Boston Harbour, Gallops Island, which was particularly well fitted for the operations of this kind, serving adequately for the purpose of isolation observations and maintenance of a large group of volunteers and personnel necessary to take care of them. So the volunteers were all between 18 and 25, 100 volunteers, and that was the most susceptible age. There were several who were around 30 years of age, but the majority were 18 to 25. None of them had had influenza, and that was from thorough history taking. They gave no account of having a temperature or febrile attack of any kind during the winter, except a few who were purposely selected as having shown a typical attack of influenza in order to test questions of immunity and for the purpose of control. So they started off quite cautiously by administering a pure culture of Bacillus influenza of Pfeiffer's, P-F-E-I-F-F-E-R's bacillus, and a rather moderate amount into the nostrils of a few of the volunteers. However, then from there they went on to, they didn't get any result from them. They didn't get sick. So they then selected 19 of the volunteers and gave each one of them a very large quantity of a mixture of some 13 different strains of the Pfeiffer bacillus, some of them obtained directly from the lungs of dead people of autopsy. Others were subcultures of varying age, and each of the 13 had, of course, a different story. There were suspensions of the organisms were sprayed into the nose, into the eyes, and to the back of the throat while the volunteers were breathing in. They used billions of organisms according to the account at the time, and none of the victims became sick. None of the volunteers became sick. So that was a little disappointing because they had 19 volunteers and none became sick after that direct introduction of the bugs. However, then they thought they would proceed to transfer the virus obtained from cases of the disease. So rather than taking it from lab-generated disease, they thought they'd get it from actual people collected from the mucus of the mouth, nose, and throat. And they gave that to the volunteers. So they always did it in the same way. They rinsed their nose with saline and then blew their noses, coughed up sputum, and took a swab from their mouth. And this they mixed, and then they again went and put this directly in this particular experiment, in which we used 10 volunteers. Each of them received a comparatively small quantity of this, about 1 cc, sprayed into each nostril, into the throat while inspiring, and on the eye. None of them became sick. Some of the same material was filtered and instilled into other volunteers who produced no results. So they actually worked on that extract of mucus and then, rather than just offering it directly. So all of the donors were patients with influenza in Boston hospitals, sometimes at the US Naval Hospital in Chelsea, sometimes at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, where we had access to suitable cases. They always kept in mind that we had no criteria of influenza. Therefore, I would like to emphasize the fact that we never took an isolated case of fever, but selected our donors from a district focus or outbreak of the disease, sometimes an epidemic in a school of 100 cases, from which we would select 4 or 5 typical cases in order to prevent mistake in diagnosis of influenza. Now, thinking that perhaps the failure to reproduce the disease in the experiments I had described was due to the fact that we obtained the material in the hospitals in Boston and then took them down to the bay to Gallops Island, which was a 4-hour trip, that it may be too long and that the virus, being potentially frail, wouldn't survive that. So they did another experiment where they obtained a large amount of material, and by special arrangements they rushed it to Gallops Island so that now the interval was down to 1 hour and 40 minutes. Now they got bolder, so each of these volunteers in this experiment, 10 in number, received 6 cc's, so that's 6 times the previous amount. They received it in each nostril, received it in the throat and in the eye, and when you think that cc was used, you will understand that some of it was swallowed. None of them became sick, so none of those 10 people. Then they thought that maybe even that amount of time was too long, and also maybe the saline solution that was part of they were using to carry the snot, that may be amicable to the virus, so it may have killed the virus. So another experiment where they would eliminate both time and salt and all other outside influences. In this experiment, we had little cotton swabs on the end of sticks, and we transferred the material directly from nose to nose and from throat to throat using a West tube for the throat culture, so as to get the material not only from the nostrils but also from the posterior nasopharynx. We used 19 volunteers, so the number's increasing each time. And it was during the time of the outbreak when we had a choice of many donors. A few of the donors were in fact in the first day of the disease, others were in the second or third day of the disease. None of these volunteers who received the material thus directly transferred from the cases took sick in any way. When I see none of them took sick in any way, I mean that after receiving the material, they were then isolated on Gallops Island. Their temperature was taken 3 times a day and carefully examined. Of course, and under constant medical supervision, they were held for 1 full week, before they were released and perhaps used again for some further experiment. All of the volunteers received at least 2 and some of them 3 shots, as they expressed it. Our next experiment consisted in injections of blood. We took 5 donors, 5 cases of influenza in the febrile stage, so during the fever. Some of them again quite early in the disease. They drew 20 cc from the arm vein of each, making a total of 100 cc's, which was mixed and treated with 1% of sodium citrate. 10 cc of the citrated whole blood were injected into each of the 10 volunteers. None of them took sick in any way. We then collected a lot of mucous material from the upper respiratory tract and filtered it through Mandler filters. While these filters will hold back the bacteria of ordinary size, they will allow ultramicroscopic organisms to pass, which would be a viral size. This filtrate was injected into 10 volunteers, each one receiving 3.5 cc subcutaneously, just under the skin, and none of these took sick in any way. The next experiment was designed to imitate the natural way an influenza spreads, at least the way in which we believe influenza spreads, and I have no doubt it does, by human contact. This experiment consisted of bringing 10 of our volunteers from Gallops Island to the US Naval Hospitals at Chelsea into a ward having 30 beds, all filled with influenza. We had previously selected 10 of these patients to be the donors, and now, if you will follow me with one of the volunteers in this ward, and remember that the other 9 at the same time were doing the same thing, we shall have a picture of just what was happening in this experiment. The volunteer was led up to the bedside of the patient. He was introduced. He sat down alongside the bed of the patient. They shook hands, and by instructions he got as close as conveniently could, and they talked for 5 minutes. At the end of the 5 minutes, the patient breathed out as hard as he could, while the volunteer, muzzle to muzzle, in accordance with instructions about 2 inches between the two, received this expired breath, and at the same time was breathing in as the patient breathed out. This they repeated 5 times, and they did it fairly faithfully in almost all of the instances. After they had done this for 5 times, the patient coughed directly into the face of the volunteer, face to face, 5 different times. I may say the volunteers were perfectly splendid about carrying out the technique of these experiments. They did it with a high idealism. They were inspired with the thought that they may help others. They went through the program in splendid spirit. Our volunteer had this sort of contact with a patient, talking and chatting and shaking hands with them for 5 minutes and receiving his breath 5 times and then his cough 5 times directly in his face. He moved to the next patient whom he had selected and repeated this and so on until the volunteer had had this sort of contact with 10 different cases of influenza in different stages of the disease, mostly fresh cases, none of them more than 3 days old. We will remember that each of the 10 volunteers had that sort of intimate contact with each one of 10 different influenza patients. They were watched carefully for 7 days. None of them took sick in any way. Then talks about some experiments at Portsmouth, which were happening simultaneously. So they started another set of experiments in February that lasted into March, again using 50 volunteers carefully selected from the Deer Island Naval Training Station. These experiments I will not give in detail, take too long. So in February and March, during the epidemic was on the wane, and they had difficulty finding donors. They were quite lucky because there was an outbreak at the Portsmouth Naval Prison. So they took their volunteers up there, and they pretty well did the same thing as they did, as I've described in the first 4 experimental cases. So they did that at Portsmouth. Out of a large number of cases, we made our selections carefully, making the typical cases for donors and transferring the material directly to our volunteers. In about 36 hours, half of the number we exposed came down with fever and sore throat, with hemolytic streptococci present and doubtless as the causal agent. All the clinicians who saw these cases in consultation agreed with us that they were ordinary cases of sore throat. Another incident. One of our officers, Dr. L, who had been in intimate contact with the disease from early in October, collected material from 6 healthy men in Portsmouth Navy Yard who were thought might be in the period of incubation of the disease. We were trying to get material as early as possible because all the evidence seems to indicate that the infection is transmissible early in the disease. None of the 6 men came down with influenza, but Dr. L came down in 36 hours with a clinical attack of influenza, although he had escaped all the rest of the outbreak. Now, the conclusion was that they don't know what happened. And so they just feel that they don't properly understand how the disease is transmitted. So they thought they knew the cause of the disease and were quite sure how it was transmitted from person to person. Perhaps if we have learned anything, it is that we are not quite sure what we know about the disease. So it's very interesting. I'm kind of fascinated. So maybe it's only transmissible before you're symptomatic in terms of this case. That might lead to that idea. But none of those healthy people at the Portsmouth Naval Yard that had from 6 healthy men in Portsmouth who were thought might have been in a period of incubation. But no one else came down with sick except for the collecting doctor. So I guess for my money, what that says is that we talk about the germ theory. We don't talk about it so much as the germ theory, but it is the germ theory. And maybe it's flawed, which was actually Pasteur's dying admission. He felt that the host was the thing, not the disease itself, that the disease was arguably would only find a fertile habitat or fertile victim if that individual was in the right state to actually be a place where the disease could multiply, where the bug could multiply. So that does suggest that bugs don't dominate, but people are either receptive or not because of their underlying or at the moment in time health status. So it throws it into the ring, and maybe it does call into question our current policy of distancing, wearing masks, staying at home, not coming into contact with others, because it would seem that it's quite hard to the Spanish flu that was actually quite potent and killed a lot of people, according to what we believe. It may have been harder to catch. It's quite interesting because when you try and get it, spread it deliberately, it doesn't happen, but it seems to happen when you don't try as much. So more to follow through on. Unfortunately, because of the current concept of medical ethics, we can't run that type of experiment today because it would just seem to be too risky and too terrible to expose people to a pathogen. So it's worth noting that when a new vaccine is trialed and they say it works, all that they do to prove it works, all they have to do is actually show that the body will create antibodies as a result of being exposed to the vaccine. So it's inferred that once you have antibodies, if you come into contact with the wild variety, that you won't get sick, that your immune system will have the head start and your body will do a good job of fighting the bug. But ethically, they're not allowed to deliberately expose people to the wild variety, the wild bug they're trying to inoculate you against, and see if it actually works in real life. They do that with the animal experiments because they don't have the same ethics rules for animals as we do for people. That may have its own, philosophically, some may feel that is no different to infecting people, infecting animals. However, to date, let's just say that the current experiment or the previous experiments for coronavirus vaccines usually came adrift at the wild virus infection state with the animal studies, and that's why we, to date, in 20 years of fairly diligent experimenting and work, haven't had an effective and safe vaccine to date. So we won't go into it any further, but that was really interesting. I thought that was a good follow-up for those that were intrigued by my comment the other week in the YouTube. So here it is. Okay, all the best.